Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is the program where we bring you all the latest political happenings on the continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I'm Rita Omodia. It's another week bringing you topical issues and the political scene around the African continent. And so far, we've also had news going on in Nigeria, Gbenga, about the Vice President, Yemi Osinbajo, finally declaring his intent to contest for the 2023 elections.
Yeah, a lot of people have been waiting for that. And it's going to make the campaigning and the political space interesting, especially the race for the APC ticket, because they are the ruling party, and a lot of people feel, they would want to work on the power of incumbency.
Especially with the leadership crisis going on. Well, we'll see how that pans out. But on the program today, we will be looking at the protests in Tunisia as thousands of opposition supporters demonstrated on Sunday in Tunis against President Kais Saied's power grip and the economic crisis in the country. Also, Chad's military government and dozens of opposition groups have started peace talks in Qatar as a first step towards ending a rebellion ahead of national dialogue in October.
The protests in Tunisia are far from over, with opposition growing in large numbers of supporters against President Kais Saied's autocratic rule and collapse of economic stability. At least 2,000 people gathered in the city centre on Sunday, chanting slogans such as "Poverty is increased" and "Famine is at our doorsteps." Protesters also held up signs in English and French reading "Tunisia, wake up," and Tunisian state is on the verge of collapse.
President Kais Saied last July sacked the government, suspended parliament and moved to rule by decree, sparking fears for democracy in the birthplace of the 2011 Arab uprisings. The latest demonstration was called by the Free Desturian Party, which is led by staunchly anti-Islamist lawyer Abri Musi. Joining us live on the conversation today is Dr. Chidochashe Nyere, postdoctoral researcher fellow at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, University of Johannesburg. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to the viewers as well.
Good afternoon. So we're looking at the issue in Tunisia, and we know that there's been a rise in the growing number of dissenting voices against Saied's rule. We've seen how much Saied's rule has turned, unfortunately, to more of an autocratic rule. Now, how long do you think these protests would last, and is there any sign of the president backing down?
So there is no sign as yet where it suggests that the president will back down and maybe fall for the protests, as we saw with President Ben Ali in 2011. But looking at the conflict from our lenses today, it is necessary for us to look at the genesis of this conflict, because what we are seeing today in Tunisia is a recalibration and a rearticulation of the issues that were still at play in 2010, even when President Ben Ali was still in power. These are the issues that have to do with the socio-economic conditions of ordinary Tunisians. So these are the issues that need to be dealt with, rather than simply looking at the protests and without any background to it, we will miss the point.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nyere. Now, one of the demands of the demonstrators is for legislative elections to be brought forward from the scheduled date of December. We do know that the president took extraordinary measures and suspended parliament last year, citing corruption and all of that. Do you think, knowing the kind of person that President Kais Saied is, will yield to the demands of the demonstrators by bringing the legislative elections forward?
I do not see him bringing the legislative elections forward. I don't see that happening. Let's get into the details of why I argue that this will just be another of those demonstrations. So we are really dealing with coloniality here. And I am afraid I'll have to take you back to the issue of colonialism, because we need to understand that colonialism may have ended, right? So in terms of the Tunisian leg of politics, the colonial contract may have ended, we can argue, in 1956, right?
Yes.
But coloniality survived colonialism. So we want to understand the cracks, or rather the structure that is behind colonialism and coloniality. Now, if we understand that, we will realize that much of these democratic principles, legislative elections, they tend to be Western-centered. They tend to be Western-centric, and we espouse Western style of democracy. Now, given the issues at hand in Tunisia, I do not think that the democracy narrative and the legislative elections narrative will survive this. In other words, if we look at how President Kais came into power, he's a caretaker president, right? He's a caretaker president. So he really has to sometimes operate authoritarianly or authoritatively. Now, this cannot sit well with Western style of democracy. But we have to understand why he is doing that, right? We have to understand why he's doing that. Let me just get into the history a bit. When we look at President Ben Ali, he had overstayed in power, right? So he had spent 23 years in power from 1987, and he fled in 2011 at the height of the Arab Spring protests. Yes. So the person who survived him, or rather, the person who came after him, he was also an interim president, a caretaker president, President Mohamed Monsef. He was a caretaker president. And again, he may not really have had the mandate of the people, right? So this is where the issue is. These guys do not necessarily have the mandate from the people to be governing. They have to come in under extraordinary circumstances. So with President Kais, he came in because President Kais Saied had died, and he died in office. Now, we should then take a cue. President Beji Caid had been democratically elected.
Yeah.
So this guy, we can say, he had the mandate of the people, and unfortunately, due to, we want to presume old age, he passed on before completing his term in office.
But sorry to butt in there, Dr. Nyere, but I mean, the current president, Kais Saied, is a constitutional lawyer, is a constitutional professor, academician. Are you saying that democracy is foreign to Tunisia? That's why we're seeing a lot of dictatorial tendencies from the current president.
Not at all. Democracy is not foreign to Tunisia. What may be foreign to Tunisia is the Western style of democracy. Okay. So democracy is a concept. We have no qualms with democracy. We can speak of the Chinese democracy, we can speak of the US democracy, we can speak of an African democracy, dare I say that. In other words, democracy is a concept. It is normative, it's not cast in stone. So the style of democracy will have to come into play here. My point was that the kind of democracy that has been carried, particularly by mass media, is a Western style of democracy.
So what style is best for Tunisia if you're saying the Western style of democracy will not favorably help the people of Tunisia?
So I will speak from my perspective,
okay,
right? And I propose a decolonial analysis into this. In other words, a decolonial democracy. Now, a decolonial democracy has to do with understanding the structure that we work with in the international arena, right? We work with states, and if we are to look at nation states, they are not necessarily a creation of Africa, right? They are not a creation of Africa, therefore they are foreign to Africa because they are an imposition by colonial masters. So this is where I then want to propose to say, in terms of what President Kais Saied has to do, right? I understand he suspended Parliament, and I understand he fired a few people in government. Now, when we look at that, the tendency is to interpret that as being autocratic, as being dictatorial, right? Yet he has an objective, because he comes into power under uncommon conditions. It really is a power grab. Of course, it's not a military coup. So we cannot suggest that he is there illegitimately. But he has no mandate from the people. What he needs to do is to stabilize Tunisia. And of course, that has to do with the economy of Tunisia. And it also implies the economy of Africa, in fact.
Okay, now talking about the economy, I know part of the protest, we saw slogans there of poverty has increased and families at our doorsteps. There are also reports that Ukraine-Russia war has plunged the country into deeper economic crisis. But according to Kais Saied, he says these are majorly just speculations and, of course, and it has caused panic buying in the country. Do you believe so? Do you believe that Tunisia is really not in economic crisis?
It is in an economic crisis, but I refuse to buy into the story that Tunisia is in an economic crisis due to the Russia and Ukraine war. Let's just leave the Russia and Ukraine war out of this. It is not an African war, therefore it is not our war, and we should not.
There are implications. Yes.
Sorry,
there are implications of that war that have real-life consequences in Africa. But I'll let you answer Rita's question.
All right, we will get into the consequences of the war, but I just wanted to take a look and a dig at the economy of Tunisia, and by implication, the economy of Africa. Now, let's look at the economic structure that Tunisia operates under, right? It is a capitalist system, and we know where that borrows from. And because the economy of Tunisia and the economy of Africa at large, it is really controlled by the world powers. So when we speak about market forces, Tunisia has very little to do and influence in terms of the global market. In fact, it is therefore only a recipient in terms of what it can do in terms of the economy. But we are digressing. The issue here is that in terms of the economic crisis, this has been compounded over the years. So we look at the causes of the Arab Spring protests, first and foremost. It was because the socio-economic environment was not tenable. Food prices were skyrocketing, fuel was expensive, so the basic commodities were unregulated in that market, and therefore it caused a lot of hyperinflation, and therefore there is this economic crisis.
Okay, Dr. Nyere, you say, sorry to button there, you say this has been building up, but if we look at the administration of President Kais Saied, do you think he has done enough to help curb this economic crisis in Tunisia?
So let's also be objective and be fair on President Kais Saied. He only came into power in 2019, right? July 2019. Yes. Now, let's look at ordinary presidential terms. We give an incumbent 5 years, and if they are re-elected, they get another 5 years. Therefore, 10 years in office will be sufficient for us then to make comments and analyze over time. So I'm just saying, I think it will be premature of us to try and analyze President Kais Said's tenure, seeing that he only came into office in 2019. So he's barely in office for three years.
Okay, so, Doctor, yes. I'd like to take you up on this point, because when you were making your last statement, you did mention the conditions, the economic conditions that led to the Arab Spring. You talked about hyperinflation, the increase in prices of staple foods. And looking at the current situation in Ukraine and Russia, a lot of this North African countries hugely depend on food imports from Russia and Ukraine, and that is currently driving up food prices. There's also a lot of disaffection. That's why we're even discussing this, because of protests against the president. You said he is a legitimate president. No one is arguing that, but his behavior, he's suspended parliament, he's sacked the Judicial Council, he has arrogated so much power to himself. Aren't these conditions ripe for another Arab Spring or protest, or even a coup d'etat, looking at the current situation in Tunisia? Or there's no much to think about that?
Thank you so much. So the simplistic answer would be to say the conditions are conducive for another uprising. That's a simplistic answer. But the real issue here, we need to go deeper than what appears to be happening. So I am arguing that in terms of what needs to happen in Tunisia, that economic structure has to change, has to be regulated. In other words, we cannot just let the free markets determine an economic trajectory of a country. Tunisia as a state should regulate that market so that then there is no issue of hyperinflation. Now, the issues in Tunisia are, among others, the high costs of living in terms of food, in terms of basic commodities, right? If that is not regulated, in other words, if government does not intervene, if government does not make an intervention, this will continue to happen, and it will be of no use to Tunisia, because the free trade, free market narrative only works with particular countries. And I may not want necessarily to go into that argument, but if it will make the point, I will definitely delve into it.
All right.
So the economic structure that Tunisia operates under is fundamentally problematic. Hence, you are now saying, in terms of the basic commodities, Tunisia has to depend on Russia for its food sources, right? And that cannot be, that a sovereign country entirely depends on another for its own survival. So that is problematic in terms of the structure that governs these two countries. So there is no fair trade, there is no fair engagement between a country like Russia and Tunisia in terms of economic size, right? Let alone military might. So that structure on its own ensures that Tunisia will always depend on other countries such as Russia. So I am proposing to say, if that structure has to be changed, it will then ensure that Tunisia can bargain and can enter into trade deals that benefit Tunisia and also benefit their chosen partners. Not that they should feel compelled to stick with this model, economic model, that clearly disenfranchises them. That's my point.
All right, Dr. Nyere, you've talked about the problematic economic structure going on in Tunisia and how that needs to change. And earlier on, you talked about this decolonial democracy. You also talked about the fact that Kais Saied was just elected in 2019, and as much there cannot be so much judgment and analysis on his conduct. But some people would say that even from the first year, you still have to analyze and review the conduct of a particular government, or else we'll have to wait till 5 years and then they bring up more propagandas. Now, still looking at Saied's government, we know that he has, for a long time, accused judges of the former Council of Corruption and of blocking inquiries. Last week, members of the new Tunisian Temporary Supreme Judicial Council were sworn in, which of course was condemned by a lot of critics. And critics called it a political purge of the judiciary. What are your thoughts on this, especially when you bring about the issue of decolonial democracy?
So I want to put it on record. My argument really is informed by a decolonial analysis on what is happening. And that entails we understand not only the economic structure, all the structures, including political structures that are at play in Tunisia. May I just bring into this debate that in Tunisia, civil society organizations are at the forefront of driving the liberal roadmap. And the liberal roadmap has all the hallmarks of coloniality. In other words, coloniality is the continuation of colonialism in its physical absence, right? Now, we cannot make an assessment and leave civil society organizations untouched. It is not like civil society organizations are apolitical, right? They report to their funders, and most of these funders do happen to be countries in the West. And
yeah, but Dr. Nyere, some of the concerns of this civil society groups are legitimate. You can't just dismiss their findings, being funded by the West and all of that. These are legitimate concerns that also echo amongst ordinary Tunisians. They're saying, look, our president is behaving like a dictator.
So they are legitimate concerns. I don't counter-argue that. In fact, I would say yes, they are legitimate concerns because Tunisia describes itself as a democracy, and therefore, in the interest of democracy and in pursuance of a multiplicity of views, they are right.
You should have a thriving civil society space, yes.
And what about the Judicial Council?
The judiciary, yes, it should also be independent. I agree. But you have to realize here, maybe I'm not making my point clear. You have to realize that there is a structure that supersedes or that backdates to even the first president of Tunisia, right? And it is that structure that has to be tinkered with. In other words, when we speak about the independence of the judiciary, it has to be independent in the truest sense, not only independent in terms of the executive of a state interfering. Mm-hmm. We also have to speak of independence from foreign meddling. And this is why I was putting the argument that civil society organizations world over, they have that tendency of always meddling in internal political affairs of a state in the name of democracy and in the name of transparency, right? Yet, when we speak of the independence of the judiciary, for instance, we do not look at how civil society organizations impact that as well. So I'm only saying the structure is there to be interrogated and objectively so from the meddling of the state, but also from the meddling of the international community through their proxies that happen mainly to be civil society organizations.
Now, still looking at the independence of civil society, I'm happy you brought that out. I know that the Amnesty International has come hard against a supposed draft law to regulate civil society organizations by the executive, by the government. Do you feel that would be necessary to regulate civil society organizations, or is still also inflicting on their independence?
I think it is only fair that any civil society organization that has to operate in a juridical territory of a state should be regulated by that state. In other words, a state is the highest sovereign to itself. There is no final arbiter beyond that. Therefore, because they do operate in that given jurisdiction, they should be regulated. Now, regulated does not necessarily mean dictated to, right? It should be regulated in the sense that they should follow the rules and the laws of a country. And this is what President Kais Saied is actually saying, right? And remember what he has done. He is saying he wants that to be a bill. He wants to pass a bill to regulate civil society organizations. So he is, if you like, he's following due process. He is not being dictatorial about this. It is the common practice world over. You table a motion, it then is interrogated And of course, there's a bit of a problem with President Kais Saied because there is no parliament. But ordinarily, this is the way to go. It has to be interrogated by the legislature. And given the outcome of the legislature, then it is passed into law.
Now, talking about the due diligence and, following the rule of law, the trial of civilians at military courts in Tunisia has also, by the Tunisian government, has been heavily criticized. This comes after the jailing of a prominent lawyer in March of 2022 for arguing with police officers. Has this act negated the right to a fair trial? And would you describe President Kais Saied and his mode of operation as government that we've seen in the last 3 years? Would you say he's a model Democrat?
I have a problem with your statement in terms of model Democrat. What is that?
I mean, is he an example that other Africans should aspire to in terms of the way he's gone about ruling his country? Are you happy with his mode of operation?
Especially when it comes to trials. I mean, can civilians be tried in a military court?
Right. So maybe we're in agreement there. I have no objective in terms of stating on record that President Kais Saied, in terms of presiding over a judicial system that has already been flawed and subjecting civilians to a military court, that is incorrect. It's not the correct way to go about it, and therefore he is intervening in the judiciary. So there is no doubt about that. I cannot defend that because I believe in the independence of the judiciary. So in this case, he is at fault because then he is presiding over a system which perpetuates, if you like, anarchy. Therefore, there is no rule of law. In fact, if anything, they are ruling by law.
All right, Dr. Nyere, earlier on you talked about the political structure in Tunisia, and I'm bringing this back now because some of the protesters and critics have said that Tunisia's parliamentary electoral formula needs to be changed. Are you of this opinion?
Yes, I am of that opinion. And I'm glad you said some Tunisians have said that. And it is their democratic right as citizens of Tunisia to voice that opinion, right? What has then to happen is that, like all countries, due processes will have to be followed. So it is a proposition. That proposition will have to, of course, be tested. Is it a popular view, or in other words, is it a democratic view, and democracy here loosely being used to mean numbers? So if it's what the majority are actually saying, then that's the way to go about it. In other words, what needs to be happening in Tunisia is negotiations, diplomacy, right? Engagement. There is need to bring all the interested parties. And the interested parties here, they will also have to include civil society organizations, right? In the spirit of democracy, all the interested parties will have to table their views and test those. Should then those prevail as the democratic preference, then so be it. And this is up to the Tunisian authorities then to implement and devise policies to support that.
Okay, it's a fine place to live it. Dr. Chidochashe Nyere, postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. It was an absolute pleasure having you share your insights with us on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the time, and thank you so much to your station for incorporating our views from the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nyere, and of course on your views on decolonial democracy. Well, we'll go for a quick break right now. When we come back on our phase 2, we'll be looking at situations in charge. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us. You're still watching The Conversation right here on News Central TV. Now, on the first belt, we talked about the situations going on in Tunisia, especially opposition protests against the President Kais Saied. Now, on our second belt, we're looking at peace talks going on in Chad. Now, Chad's military government and dozens of opposition groups started peace talks on Sunday in Qatar as a first step towards ending a rebellion and holding elections. The landlocked African nation was thrown into turmoil by the killing of longtime leader Idris Deby Itno in battle with rebels in the country's north last April. His son, Ahmed Idris Deby Itno, took over the country after his death, fronting a 15-member military junta and vowing to hold free elections. Meanwhile, Chad's Prime Minister Albert Pahimi Padeke and African Union Commission head Moussa Faki Mahamat told the opening of the conference that both sides would have to make concessions for the talks to succeed.
Now, some 44 armed rebel and opposition groups were invited to the Doha meeting, though some were missing at the opening, which had already been delayed from February the 27th. Diplomats said that these precursor talks will take weeks and that a planned national dialogue due to start on May the 10th may have to be delayed. Under the younger Deby's plan, the dialogue would be a prelude to agreeing on a new constitution and then holding elections. Chad has a long history of volatility since gaining independence from France in 1960, and tens of thousands have died in various conflicts. Now, joining the conversation to discuss this development in Doha and more is Abdulateef Ahmed, Head of Research and Monitoring Desk at News Central. Thanks you for joining us, Abdulateef.
Thank you for having me.
Now, following the death of long-term ruler General Idris Deby Itno, the Chadian Military Council announced that they will hold elections and transfer power to a democratic government in 18 months. How is that going, and are you confident they will keep to the timetable?
Already the president of the military ruling council has expressed the need and desire to ensure that there's a transition that is smooth. The opposition leader in the country has expressed interest in seeing that happens. He did that last year in the hope that there will be an all-inclusive government that will ensure that the stakeholders in governance will come into play and see how the transition becomes smooth. So far, it's suffered a little setbacks here and there. However, it looks like there will be light at the end of the tunnel.
All right, Abdulateef, and talking about stakeholders, we know how much France has at stake in Chad, and it came so much as a shock to a lot of people last year when General Idris Deby died on the battlefront. But some questions come in as, why was France not quick to condemn the appointment of late Idris Deby's son, Mohamed Deby, as president, even though it was against the constitution of Chad, which has since been suspended?
I think foreign players in the national development of various African countries are comfortable with personalities they feel are within the corridors of power who understand the diplomatic relationships between themselves and the country, as the case may be. It seems to them that the son of Idris Deby understands what is at stake and will be willing to play along mutual lines. And I think that is primarily responsible for why France did not kick against his assumption of office.
Now, Abdulateef, why has the Chadian government decided to negotiate with the opposition groups, and what are these talks in Doha all about? In faraway Qatar, a lot of people are saying, you know, we've started having a conversation about solving African problems by Africans. So why are the Qataris mediating into this? And I do know that the chairman of the African Union Council, Mr. Faki Mahamat, who happens to be Chadian himself, was also present in Doha. What do you make of all of this?
The first thing we must understand is for us to have almost 50, about 44 groups who are holding on to opposition in their own, will I call it, in their own regards of mounting pressure against government. Ordinarily, if they had similar or related grievances against the state, it should ordinarily mean that they would have come together and form a formidable front. But for 44 disparate groups to say they are going to negotiate with the central government, individually or collectively, but enunciating individual concerns, it goes a long way to tell you that the concerns are such that they are multifaceted, they are hydra-headed, and they will rather have such discussions in a place where issues can be sorted out and is seen as a neutral ground. I doubt if there's anywhere around the continent, where they can hold these talks and there may not be breakdown of law and order. For instance, if you were to go northwards, you'll be going into Libya. Libya is slightly unstable at the moment. If you say you want to go into Niger, Niger has its own
basically
issues.
all the countries that border
Chad at the moment have these issues to contend with. So they would rather have somewhere neutral. And I think Doha was the meeting ground for disagreeing factions from Afghanistan who met last year also. So it seems to me that it is beginning to become a place where warring factions are able to parley and reach a consensus.
Now, talking about negotiations, we know that some opposition groups are critical of the talk even before its launch, and a number of them are absent. Do you know why this is so?
It is understandable. It's a country that is battling to regain its strength and root its foot in the sands of time. You will recall that one of the opposition groups, the FACT, were said to be responsible for the death of the ex-president Idris Deby. So while these talks are going on, they have grievances that they feel that they would rather take on the government on a different level of negotiation as compared with having every other person, every stakeholder discuss alongside with them. So they seem to be the strongest voice against the government at the moment.
I'm happy you mentioned this group, the Friends for Change and Conquer. The group President Idris Deby was fighting before he was killed, and they had set conditions that they want before they can participate in the talks, which is one of the most the biggest groups. So how significant is this group, and will their decision not to participate affect the overall outcome and resolutions that comes out of these talks at Doha?
Already they are asking that all political prisoners be released. All of their members who have been in custody must be released, and their confiscated assets has to be released. And doing all of that at once without them signifying the willingness to drop their arms may be counterproductive for the country. And therefore, the president has released some of them, not all of them, but he has made significant show of understanding and need to move the discussion forward. And so it is expected that this rebel group are able to also move closer to the middle point and resolve issues going forward.
While a lot of people are looking forward to these peace talks and, of course, fruitful resolutions, we all know of some of the humanitarian consequences of these long and continuous battles with rebel groups and opposition groups in Chad. How do you feel this has affected humanitarian conditions in Chad?
So a lot is nearly impossible when there is heightened tension and concern amongst locals in the country. Again, investors from across the continent and outside the continent will be concerned about peace and state and breakdown of law and order when opposition groups, armed insurgents, threaten peace and security in the country. So a lot of people, while hoping that the transition will be smooth, the transition will birth something new, the fears and concerns have impeded growth and development in the country, in the last few months.
Now, Abdulateef, we do know how significant the relationship between France, the colonial master of Chad, and the late President Idris Deby, who was the darling of the West, and quite rightly so, because he was a strategic partner in their fight against terrorism in the Sahel. Chad was, and I believe is still, a major troop contributor to African Union missions in the Sahel. And now that the late President Idris Deby isn't there anymore, and looking at France's record of being averse to negotiations with terrorist groups, like in Mali, for example, the government, they expressly said during Operation Berkane they would have no talks with terrorist or armed groups. And looking at this reconciliatory spirit in Doha, would you suggest is the way forward, or we should have a two-pronged approach, because military on one side and then try to, negotiate yourself out of the conflict?
Going by the first few diplomatic engagements of Mohamed Deby immediately at the demise of his father, it seems to me that he wants to, knowing fully well that this group has become extremely dangerous and very well armed, he has realized that there's need to explore first the diplomatic approaches to counter-insurgency and to see how they can be brought in to their grievances can be resolved without having to escalate military expeditions, to reclaim parts of the country and expel these groups, as the case may be. However, it's also understandable that having been in the army for well enough to know what to do and how to go about it, in the event that these talks break down, there's a chance that transition into democracy may be affected, and he may be tempted to stay a little longer to battle the insurgents and the armed groups. He would rather do that than hand over to a democratic government wherein his own life and the lives of most politically exposed persons will be affected in the country.
All right, let's hold on that thought there while we still wait to see the outcome of these talks. Let's hear from the Prime Minister of Chad and hear what he has to say.
Nécessaire rétroviseur de notre histoire doit nous servir à marquer le pas pour mieux aller de l'avant et non à engager une marche arrière suicidaire sur nos blessures. La réconciliation et l'esprit de tolérance doivent l'emporter sur la revanche et la colère. Le succès d'une transition politique apaisée et consensuelle est un défi difficile à relever par le Tchad tout seul, sans l'accompagnement de la communauté internationale. La réussite de cette transition est la principale mission à laquelle mon gouvernement consacre toute son énergie et tout son temps avec l'appui de la communauté internationale et des pays amis que je salue solennellement. Et la paix demande plus de courage et de grandeur que la guerre. Être capable d'activer la gâchette intérieure du dépassement de soi pour vaincre le désir de revanche et de rancune exige plus de courage que la guerre. Bref, le vrai courage ne consiste pas à brandir son arme pour vaincre, mais plutôt à prendre le risque de la baisser pour convaincre.
L'histoire du Tchad, jalonnée de conférences, de tentatives de réconciliation, d'accords non respectés, est bien connue de tous, et surtout de vous. 60 années de conflits armés, de destruction, d'occasions de renaissance perdues, presque l'âge de notre État contemporain. N'est-il pas temps d'arrêter cette folie du nihilisme et de l'absurde absolu?
All right, there we heard from the AU chairperson there, that's Mr. Fahi Mahamat. We also heard from the Prime Minister of Chad, and that is Albert Pahimi. And he said something striking there. He said the main mission of his government is the success of these talks. And I think right now we're coming to a situation where negotiations are on the front burner, taking a look at Ethiopia. But how high are the chances of Chad sliding back to a major conflict if these talks don't work? And do you even see these talks leading to a lasting solution to peace in Chad?
I'll express optimism over
Pessimism.
pessimism, as the case may be. that hopefully there will be a compromise and then the need for all the warring factions to see the reason why the country should be able to move forward. However, considering the fact that the West African sub-region and the Sahel generally, as the case may be, is battling insurgency on all fronts. And what it means also is that the insurgents in Chad have more insurgent groups to rely on. They have more logistics to be able to exploit. They have more intel to be able to rely on and to deploy against the state. It becomes a little disturbing that in the event that peace talks fail, Chad may have a prolonged and intense battle with insecurity.
And also understanding the complex nature of the environment where they are, north, south, east, west. They're bordered with countries with serious situation, security concerns there. Abdulateef, Ahmed, this is where we drop the anchor on today's show. It was a pleasure having you, as always.
It's a pleasure being here.
That's it on today's conversation. It's been quite an interesting one, and I'm looking forward to Wednesday. Nigeria's Vice President, like we said, strong his heart in the 2023
We're seeing lots of strong heads coming up for 2023 elections. We're looking at Nigeria, looking at the possible way forward. Earlier on last week, talked about the Electoral Act Amendments Bill going on in Nigeria. So fingers across while in the West African region, we're looking for peace negotiations becoming at the front burner and, of course, being a part of the country. This is where we'll drop it for today's edition of The Conversation. I am Rita Omodia. See you on Wednesday.
And I'm Gbenga Aborowa. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.